49 on the announcement, but episode 50 of Sports Shorts. I'm Bobby Hacker, the Sports Shorts guy, and our guest today is Johnny Gray, Senior Managing Director of Ankara in the UK, and an old rugby pal of mine from the Santa Monica Rugby Club. So Johnny, thanks for joining us.
Bobby, it's great to be here.
Well, I really appreciate it. I know it's a little late for you because you're calling in from London, so thanks again for making the time. We really appreciate it. And we like to start out our show every time with our guest I could say you're the senior managing director of something, but what does that mean? So our first question is to tell us a little bit about what your current job is and the path you took to get there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bobby, and it's great to be here. And yeah, senior managing director of something, and I guess I'm also trying to figure it out because I'm relatively new at Ankara, 4 months in now. Ankara is a global expert services and advisory firm, and I've joined to really help grow their business in the sports sector. And we, as a company, help the sports sector, if you like, manage through change. That can be good change, it can be acquisitions or other positive things, or it can be challenges and the like. So we're, if you like, people try and sort of understand it. I often say it's a bit like one of the big four without tax and audit. So it's all the advisory stuff that you would find in a big four company. Prior to this, how did I get here? I spent the last few years prior to this actually in-house in sport. I was recruited from my prior company, where you and I also know each other from, to go in-house with professional tennis, to implement the findings of a 2018 review into integrity in the sport of tennis globally. And that review had 200 or so recommendations as to how tennis should handle integrity challenges in the sport, largely to do with competition manipulation as a result of the boom in the betting market and app-based betting. So I did that for a few years. I set up a thing called the International Tennis Integrity Agency, and was its first chief executive, and brought in a range of capabilities into that organization, including the anti-doping program. And at the completion of that, I went back to consulting, and some of my team from my previous firm were with Ankara, and one thing led to another, and I've joined them. And a few months in, and it's great. I'm really enjoying it, and bright future ahead.
I think the word integrity is a little more, dare I say, grounded in the rest of the world that's been dealing with, especially in the betting frame, that people think about integrity. And as I often like to say, 10 or 11 years ago, I remember being in a hotel room watching the UEFA semifinals and being stunned that the first commercial at the half was, "You still have time to place your bets with blank." And I'm like, what? So now here in the US, betting is pretty prevalent. But can you talk a little bit about what really the integrity component means and what we're looking out for, especially not just in betting, but on a general principle basis?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to see what's going on in the US, Bobby, and you and I have talked about this before. And as I look at what's happening in the liberalization of the betting market in the US, you're sort of 10 years behind Europe, if you like. Europe went through this. It learned some lessons along the way, and we can come back to those, if you like, and how they might bear on the US. But of course, once you have app-based betting, in-play betting, and it's ubiquitous here, as you know. Just about everybody takes a bet on their app, on their phone, and so on. So the liquidity in the market is absolutely enormous. And sadly, that does mean that within that, there is going to be a really small element of match fixing. And tennis in particular, I know the most about. It's very vulnerable to that for really three reasons. One, is that it is a sport of individuals playing a lot of different outcomes in a tennis match. Every single point is a change in the odds, a change in the dynamic of the game. So you can bet on all these things. Secondly, it's a very nuanced sport, so very difficult to determine, if somebody deliberately lost that game or they were just relaxing before coming back strong in the next set. So there's a lot of nuance in it, and tennis players are self-employed athletes, and unless they win prize money at the middle to lower levels of the pyramid, they are not making a living. So the temptation is there. And then finally, of course, there's enormous liquidity in the market, so it's quite easy to hide very nuanced fixes. So that's a big challenge. And, it's something which the sport of tennis and other sports, it's interesting, the other individual sports, table tennis, badminton, similar sort of challenges. And then you also just get challenges in football, soccer, because of the sheer size of it globally, more difficult to fix, but potentially higher gains for those who do. So all of this comes with betting. It's if you like, it's the downside of that. Although there are, some people would argue there's some positive aspects of betting. We can debate that, but those are the downsides. And sports, I think, have all sports. I mean, you've probably seen just in the news, there's issues going on in snooker at the moment. There's been issues with boxing recently, both of which have come to the fore. All sports are sort of working out how to get this right, because the money they get from selling the data to the data companies, who then in turn sell it into the betting markets, is phenomenal. Enormous amounts of money, which, if you like, funds the sport, pays for the prize money, pays for the events themselves. So they're trying to work out, how do you balance the risk of competition manipulation and so on with the positives of the revenue. And I think tennis has done a great job. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But done a very good job, and other sports are coming to terms with it. I think in the US, it seems to me that this is something which has not yet quite dawned on the US sports, primarily the American sports, major leagues and so on. Very interesting how that plays, collegiate sport, all of that, all to come.
Well, it's interesting because here in the US, as you may know, back in the 1950s, there's a big scandal about in New York, college basketball players, literally mafia guys. It sounds, I'm saying that because that's what it was. Paying these players to throw games or to,
right,
adjust margins on the bet and whatnot. And it's been, almost 70 years of the US sort of going, we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen. And then the slippery slope, it would seem, went from fantasy sports, which I remember going to the NFL, seeing my first FanDuel ad, calling the NFL and saying, why are you allowing this gambling ad? Oh, it's not gambling, it's fantasy sports. And from fantasy sports to a change of a particular law in the US and opening up the markets to state by state online betting, it's just the Wild West. Now,
right,
I'm assuming there's greater controls, but let me jump back a second. When you started the International Tennis Integrity Agency, there in tennis, how did you sort of begin an investigation? Were there whistleblowers out there? Were you just looking at the betting markets and saying, why are these numbers shifting so drastically? How do you actually check and police this sort of activity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing to say is that, in the sport of professional tennis worldwide, there are, throughout the pyramid at any one time, hundreds of tennis games which are offered, as the technical term is, offered to the markets, going on any one stage. So It's not something you can do mechanically. It's a data play, and essentially the primary source of intelligence is from the betting markets. Bearing in mind, of course, that they are the financial loser if a match is fixed. The sport is the reputational loser, but the betting market's the financial loser. And they have various obligations in a regulated market to monitor and report suspicious betting activity. And they report that to the sport, in tennis's case, the International Tennis Integrity Agency. So that is the primary source. And then that information in the intelligence process is correlated with other information, with performance data increasingly. And if all of that sort of looks like there may have been an offence, then an investigation is open. Now, that's not to say there aren't whistleblowers. That does happen, but I would say 95% is from the betting markets, and of course the challenge is that is the regulated market. So you're just not getting that coverage from what the other areas of the betting market. There's a sort of area called what they call the under-regulated market, which are in jurisdictions where there's the poor controls, and then there's the whole sort of Asian, completely unregulated, completely off the books betting, which is what cricket suffers from, and much more difficult in cricket to solve this problem. But in tennis, very good coverage on the regulated markets, and that's how it starts.
So you also mentioned an issue that has been discussed endlessly here the last few years in particular, which is data.
Right.
Because now we have so much raw information, performance analytics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Various sports handle it different ways. In the US, we have players' associations that under their collective bargaining agreements allow how it can be used, when it can be used, et cetera, et cetera. In a sport like tennis, does each individual tennis player, because they're an individual, have to sign away whatever data rights they want to give up? How is that even regulated?
Well, you talked about the Wild West, and I think performance data and who owns it is one of the coming issues for all sports globally. At the moment, what happens is the rights holder, the competition, the people who run the competition, they publish the results. So in a way, they're not necessarily publishing the individual athlete's personal data, heart rates, things like that, which are different sort of data sets. They're just saying who won this point, who won that game, and so that data belongs to the rights holder, and they can monetize that, in any way they choose to. But of course, when you come to a sport like soccer, where you're getting much more into sort of how fast do people run, what stamina they have, those sort of issues which are relevant for betting, especially if you're doing contingent betting during a game. That's a fascinating area, Bobby, and that's definitely subject to dispute in the UK at the moment, but in the Premier League, and I suspect in the US, from what we've talked about before and others, these are big areas. There's big money at stake here, but there's also privacy issues and
exactly.
all that.
Yeah, I think the privacy issue is the biggest one for athletes, because they see how it could potentially be used against them. You're negotiating a deal and they say, well, look, I mean, we found out that, your heart rate was abnormally high in these situations and and it impacts people's potential earnings.
Right.
But by the same token, you have the member clubs of whatever the the competitions, the leagues, whatnot. They are probably making significant sums, selling all these betting entities, the performance data on the field. For example, so-and-so was called offside 3 times in a match. He had 8 strikes at the ball, 7 wide. I mean, a variety of things that you can come up with. And that's sort of the guys that are making the odds on these games are using all of that to say, well, it seems like, old Cristiano Ronaldo has slowed down a step, or, there must be something wrong that Arsenal's already won 14 games and only drawn 2, whatever. So there's a lot of a lot there, and if I'm a player, the question is what voice do I have? In the U.S., the voice is pretty strong because of the players' associations saying, well, look, if it relates to any data tracking that you're using about us, that's my privacy right, and we're not bargaining it away. So I think there's a real issue with moving forward in various competitions, particularly as you were talking about, whether it's tennis or table tennis or individual sports. Is every athlete now going to, before they enter a competition, be faced with releasing any of their personal data tracking information? Because in the betting markets, we're talking about trillions of dollars, and these guys want to get every advantage they have to look into their crystal ball to post odds. But I don't see players wanting to give that up, especially if they're not getting a piece of the pie.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I mean, I would make the distinction we talked about between competition data and personal data, which also has HIPAA-related considerations. Sure. And so on. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. But I think you're right. And, it comes, we've seen over here as well recently with sponsorship. We've seen a collapse of sponsorship deals in Australia with women's netball, with British cycling, with an oil and gas company, where athletes are saying, listen, I'm not wearing that logo for ESG, environmental reasons, or whatever. Kylian Mbappe, you may have seen in the World Cup, covered up the Budweiser logo. So you see athletes becoming much more active in controlling what they are associated with from a branding point of view, but also, what's happening to their data. All of that, Bobby, I think those are the coming issues in sport.
Yeah, well, you have to look back to Michael Jordan playing on the Dream Team, and the U.S. was not wearing Nike gear, and he put an American flag over the logo, so he didn't. So the question is could Nike have said, gee, we really appreciate it if you would cover it up, or are players getting paid, or what's happening, or personal beliefs? I think Mbappe was a personal belief he didn't want to be associated with. But these are important issues, because as these player contracts have grown and grown and grown and grown, and the valuations of the various clubs across the sports have grown and grown and grown, you're trying to get money, and that sponsorship dollars are really important. Now, I don't know if you've seen this in Europe, but the big sponsorship issue here in the US is crypto, where FTX, for example, had all these naming rights deals. And I mean, at Berkeley, they had the field naming rights. It was FTX Field at Memorial Stadium. And as soon as that ship folded, the next game, they painted over the FTX and had something else in its place. But you lose that money, that's a big hit.
Yep.
And, at what point are we getting so far down the road with these valuations based upon sponsorship that you lose a sponsor? How does that impact sports overall? When you have teams committing to, hundreds of millions of dollars of payroll.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. You see in the Premier League now, various American owners looking to sell up now that the European Super League's not going to happen. They probably figured they've got the maximum return they're going to get And the valuations of these clubs means that, in order to have a revenue stream, you've got to monetize everything. Now, I think what's happened back to the betting situation, because we're maybe 10 years ahead of you over the other side of the pond, I think we're beginning to see a lot more due diligence into picking the right sponsorship partners. So go back a few years ago, you would see a lot of betting logos on football strip shirts. That has either been regulated out in places like Spain or self-policed out. I think dodgy Eastern European crypto, Asia crypto firms. I think rights holders are just looking, and one of the things my company does, is a little more deep due diligence into just who exactly are these people, how sustainable is their revenue streams, what is their reputation, what is their environmental footprint, what are if you like, their supply chains, because if you've got something worth that much, you don't want to tarnish that brand by associating yourself with the wrong thing. And it'd be fascinating to see betting advertising. One of the things in tennis that tennis took a stand on, and other sports in the US have not done this, is that no player can be directly sponsored by a betting company, because obviously the player can affect the outcome of a match, and that would be a totally inappropriate relationship in the view of tennis. But you see other sports, golf, the players, the bags, everything's plastered with betting logo. So I think all of this in the US is gonna find its place, and mistakes were made in Europe, and I'm sure they're going to be made in the US.
So the question is policing that. And you hear stories here about, oh, we caught this guy. There's a case with an Atlanta Falcons player who, when he was on injured reserve, placed a football bet not on his team and got a years-long suspension.
Right.
And this seems to be, part of the learning process. And I think that the key to enforcing my opinion only, the key to really enforcing these integrity issues begins with education. And I think it's incumbent upon the leagues and the member teams, and whether in the individual sports, the associations, to mandate, you got to show up here and you got to listen to this and understand this and ask a few questions. Now, am I being over the top? Maybe, but I don't think so. Because I think, if you said, we told you, you saw the course, you know what to do, you didn't do it, don't complain about the sanction. I think the most activity happens where somebody gets sanctioned and they're like, I didn't know. Well, I mean, a lot of those that I didn't know is nonsense, because think about what you're doing, you're not allowed to, and you did.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right. In most sports now, over here at least, and certainly tennis worldwide, you cannot play professional tennis if you have not undertaken the integrity training and passed it. Every player, from the top of the pyramid right down to the ITF, if you like, what they used to call the futures, has to do that. And they do that for two reasons. One, to educate them, so they know, okay, I didn't realize I couldn't do this, or I can't do that. But also for this to stand up in, ultimately the appeal is the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne. If they've not been educated, then the sport has failed in its duty to educate them, and the charges will be thrown out. So that is the way it is now outside of the US. As I said, I think the US is going to find its way with this. The one thing, just to reassure you about, is that the returns for players on fixing a match compared to the salaries of major league players are so small that for a major league player to fix an outcome in a match, to miss a field goal, or whatever the fix is, the reward is just not going to be there. So if you look at tennis and football, soccer, the problem is further down the pyramid, where the athletes aren't really making a sustainable living, and that the money that's offered for fixing a match, $5,000 or whatever, is life changing to a Tunisian player or a somebody of that background. So you have got that, but I sense that what will happen as the data revenues flow and people see this is, and this happened, in all sports outside the US, is that you start monetizing way down the pyramid, where you are much more vulnerable to match fixing for the reasons I just talked about. And so it'll be very interesting to see in the States what happens, further down, collegiate sport, and all of that. Fascinating.
Well, especially in collegiate sports now, we've now launched into the era, we're 18 months into the world of name, image, and likeness rights of these players. And without a national standard, and I think we're at 29 state laws that are all different, and then states that don't have laws. And, I'm a college football player and I know I'm not going to play pro, and somebody offers me money to do something that's going to change the outcome of a game. Yeah, am I more likely to want to take that and call it, I sold my name, image, and likeness, I didn't throw anything? That to me is where we're way over our skis in this country. And it seems to me a very perilous place in which to be. And I'm not seeing, and if you've heard of anything, I don't know, I've not seen in the context of all this money flowing into name, image, and likeness an overview of integrity. And I think we have to get there. But when you have the NCAA that no longer has the global rights it had based on recent Supreme Court decision, it's a very scary place. And, I think the potential for things happening in college sports is just a swamp.
I think you're right to be worried.
Well, look, thank you for taking a half hour of time. I know it's late in the evening for you. I appreciate it. It was great talking with you. Really appreciate it. And, we may have some more issues as we in America deal with the betting world and college sports. And we may drag you back onto the show again, Johnny, to talk a little more.
Well, anytime, Bobby, and I'm, pleased to be with you. And look, I think the trouble in my line of work, and we're advising a couple of nation states on how to get these things right at the moment, is sort of, you see the downside always. And of course, as we know, 99% of sport is fantastic, great to watch, amazing to participate in. And I wouldn't want to detract from that. But I think keeping an eye on these issues would behoove the US well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And everybody, we're now in a new year. So if you haven't renewed your membership to the Sports Lawyers Association, go to sportslaw.org, renew your membership. It has been for years now on an annual basis. So it's January, renew your membership, because at the end of February, all of your access will be cut off if you don't renew. And also renew so you're ready to sign up in the beginning of March, when we put out the announcement for our annual conference, which will be in May 11th, 13th here in Los Angeles. And be on the lookout. We're having an interesting women's sports and our International Women's Day. We're doing a webinar. So lots of other programming happening here at the SLA. So go to sportslaw.org, learn more about it. Johnny, get to bed. Thanks very much.
Yeah, we'll do.
Yes. We'll see you all in a couple.